Opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. It is Monday, the 20th of April, 2026. Let's pull up this headline. We are going to be talking about meningitis today. High alert, meningitis outbreak stabilizes, but health chiefs vigilant to new cases after some wrongly told that they have the bug. So high drama in England over meningitis. So who better to put this right than Dr. Suzanne Humphries? Good morning, Dr. Suzanne Humphries.
Good morning, Polly.
Well, so we need to know the truth about meningitis because everybody's losing their minds about the fact that they're probably going to die if they get it. So can you put it right, please?
I will certainly do my best. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. All right, so basically we're going to look at the big picture on meningitis because how people get into trouble is they just look at the little picture in a state of fear. So let's try to set some of this straight, okay? And I've just basically taken some of the news headlines from the March 2026 meningitis outbreaks in the UK, which literally made headlines worldwide, right? And so here you can see, they're using words like deadly meningitis, concern, unprecedented outbreak, alarm in Britain, 2 dead, 11 sick, and deadly meningitis, campus shutdown, cases rise, and unprecedented again and again. So these are the kinds of news headlines that went on, and they made people believe that nothing like this has ever happened before, and it was really bad, and people were dying. Okay, and that's not true. Except some people did die, and we need to talk about that in detail, and we will in a moment. So the next slide is basically an infographic from the deadly outbreak, the killer meningitis that's spreading in Kent, and you can see, the alarmist slant that's been taken on this because that's what sells news and it also sells vaccines. Okay, so the next slide talks about the situation. And the situation was that there was this high contact event in a crowded student nightclub in Canterbury over the weekend of the 5th to 7th of March 2026. And so the first cases were reported around the 13th to 16th of March. And then there was some cases that had rapid deterioration and led to hospitalizations. And it quickly hit University of Kent students and some local sixth form pupils. These are like teenagers, I believe. And it's been called the perfect storm. And it probably was actually the perfect storm. And the difference is that in a storm, there's not a lot you can do about the weather, but there is a lot you can do about this particular perfect storm. And we'll talk about this. Now, one of the reasons that was given for these students to have developed meningitis is because their vaccine program for infants began in 2015. And these students were born before that. So they missed out on their opportunity to get immunized. Okay, so we'll talk more about that as well. Further searching showed that, as Polly mentioned in the beginning, that the statistical record actually had to be amended on the 23rd of March because 14 cases were removed due to inaccurate diagnosing. But you know what? That doesn't matter because once the news is out and the panic sets in and the vaccinating goes ahead and the Cipro antibiotics are given out like candy, there's really no brakes that can be put on after that. So tens of thousands of people went and got the vaccine, not just around Kent, but probably all over the world because why risk it? You don't want to take a chance, right? And antibiotics were literally doled out like Halloween candy. So over 13,500 doses of preventive antibiotics had been administered or distributed by late March 2026 in this region. All right. So the next slide shows the latest official data, which can be found at the link that I put there. And I checked again yesterday just to see if anything had been updated, and it hasn't been updated since the 1st of April. So that's all we know now, that there were 21 confirmed cases and that all of them were the same bacteria, although only 18 could be subtyped. When I queried why, because they didn't have enough samples from them. And there were 2 deaths since the start of the incident. And they weren't in, like people in wheelchairs or anything like that. They were in what seemed to be normally functioning students. I just wanted to look around the world and see what else was going on. And so The UK was not the only area where there were cases of meningococcal B meningitis reported. In the United States, there was a cluster of invasive disease that began in mid-January 26 that also had 2 deaths. Did anybody hear about that, I wonder? And it was described as unusually high for the season, but it resolved or stabilized before the Kent outbreak happened. In Vietnam, there was a sharp national rise in meningococcal disease, 95 in the past year, which was up 353%. And some of them were not meningitis B, some of them were serogroup W, which another vaccine would be used for. And it's an ongoing increase. It wasn't anything new. And then in New Zealand in 2026, there were 2 cases at the university, but no deaths. Because, they went and they vaccinated everybody and gave antibiotics. And that's kind of the rhetoric that you hear about the New Zealand issue. All right, so the next slide, I just want to show you some of the numbers of confirmed cases and deaths in the UK since the vaccination program began in 2015. And that's what you can see here. And it was first given to older children, and then it was given to babies in the UK. And what I want you to notice about this slide is that on the right-hand column, that the case fatality rates are pretty much the same as they've always been, okay? And we've had, in some instances, 800 cases, and then it goes down to 80 one year, and then back up to 396. So this actually isn't anything new. The next slide is going to show us the USA from 2015 to 2023. And yes, there is some death that has happened. And when it happens, the bacteria is always blamed, or the lack of vaccines. That's what the news is always about. We don't have any data that I was able to locate easily anyway after 2023 for USA. I didn't try that hard, actually, but I couldn't find it on the same search that I found all this. So the next slide, slide number 10, shows the pre versus post Men B vaccine campaign eras, both US and UK, all right? So pre was before 2015 and post was after 2015. And this chart shows us in the top 2 rows, the USA death and data, which seems to have declined after 2015, right? And the second 2 rows show us the UK data also seeming to reflect a decline in cases and deaths after 2015. And so if you were to just look at this, you would go, oh, well, the vaccine must have had some effect, and it must be the entire story of what happened here. The media portrays the importance of vaccines whenever these numbers are displayed, right? So let's look at the next slide, because I think this is really telling. This came out directly out of a document from the UK. This is the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization. That's basically their version of our
ACIP?
The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization. It's basically their version of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, the ACIP. That they're supposed to be an independent expert advisory committee, but as we know, they were far from independent. Paul Offit was on there for a very long time. Okay, enough said. So while that data that I just showed you in those previous slides shows that the incidence of invasive meningococcal B drastically declined in the years since the vaccine was given to infants in the UK in 2015, if we view official data from the JCVI right here out of their own document, we see that the drop was already occurring between 2003 and 2012, as we can see using that red line that indicates babies under 1 year of age. And any vaccine could have made the incidence seem to decline, right? Because it was already going down. So where have we seen this before? Let me just summarize here. So in this slide, we are looking at 2003 all the way on the left up to 2012. And what we see is the incidence of invasive meningococcal disease in England and Wales dropping significantly by about 50% in babies less than 1 year old, okay? So where have we seen this before? So here is something you can look at free on the Dissolving Illusions website. And pertussis and measles really stand out because those vaccines came in pretty much at the end of the death decline. And so while this this graph that I'm showing you now depicts death. Even some of the incidence graphs in dissolving illusions show the slow decline of incidence before a vaccine was introduced. And I'm showing this just because I'm trying to show you that regarding meningitis, the background of the person and the world that they live in makes a huge difference to susceptibility and survival. That's the entire point of dissolving illusions, and that's the point that I want to make to you today so that you can stop being afraid and start being proactive and get your lives together so you don't have to worry about any microbe, let alone one with a specific serotype that they may have developed a vaccine that may give you short-term immunity if you're lucky. Getting back to that JCVI document, I clipped this directly out of there, and I just want to point out that the committee explicitly says that there was a lack of evidence on actual vaccine efficacy because Bexsero, which is the vaccine used against meningococcal B, had not yet been evaluated in an efficacy trial and was not being used yet routinely anywhere in the world. They say that a short-term efficacy of 95% was used in the model. Always beware when they're using models. We know what that happened with Ferguson and COVID and all that. So was used in the model as a plausible estimate, as they say, based partly on immunogenicity, which basically means that they take blood out of someone that's vaccinated and see what antibody levels they have, and partly on experience with one of the four main components of the vaccine in New Zealand that was used back in, I believe it was 2004, around that. I'm going to get into this later at the end. I'm going to talk a lot about New Zealand because New Zealand's vaccine pretty much set the stage for the use of this exact type of vaccine all around the world without doing proper efficacy trials. Okay, so we'll get back into this later, but first, because here we are talking about meningitis, I just want to just break down a little bit for you. And what is meningitis? What is bacterial meningitis? What is meningococcal B? All right, so for those of you who are addicted to the electron micrograph, I've got one for you, and it's on the left, and it's basically been colored in so that you can understand the different parts of the bacteria. And you can see this classic shape of meningococcus, okay? It basically looks like two cells together because they seem to always be in this dividing configuration. I don't understand why, but this is how it is. And there are other bacteria that when we look at, we see them, they're called diplococci. Okay, so in the diagram on the right, I've labeled the elements in blue that can be used as vaccine components in Bexsero, okay? So the ones that have the blue boxes, and I'm not going to get into what those all are. If you all want to look that up, it just would take too much time. But I just want to point out that the PORA, P-O-R-A, is a major outer membrane protein that's most often used in the subtyping during the outbreaks, okay? And the Trumenba vaccine, which is the other vaccine, only uses one factor, the H binding protein, otherwise called FHBP. But the elements in the red boxes are also really strong virulence factors that can't be targeted by vaccines. And there are actually more vaccine adverse events in Bexsero because it uses more antigen. So naturally, you're going to have a stronger immune response to it and you're going to have more side effects. But it's because of that, it's also considered more effective, kind of just like the whole cell whooping cough bacteria vaccine was more effective but more reactogenic, and then they moved to the acellular one that we're using now, which is less effective but less reactogenic. Kind of goes hand in hand. Okay, so there's your pictures and what we're really looking at. And look, I don't want to underplay this. This is an evil little bacteria, and it's got a lot of tricks in up its sleeve about how it can invade you, right? But it's certainly not a given that it's going to. And I'll talk about how we find it in the throats of healthy people and they never get sick. We'll get into that in a minute. So the next slide, I just want to show you, because we hear meningitis, but I think a lot of people out there don't really know what even a meninge is. So here's a cutout view of an area of the skull, and it includes all of the relevant layers so that anyone that doesn't even have a medical degree at all can understand what meninges are. And so there are these three layers that sit between the brain and the skull, right? And they're really designed to protect the brain, to hold it in place, to bathe it in the fluid that it thrives in. And so the outermost one is called the dura mater, which basically means, I think it means the tough mother. And it's thick and it's tough and it helps with brain stability and some protection from infection. And the middle layer, the arachnoid matter, arachnoid means spider, obviously, it's a very important one, and it has a lot of spider-like villi in it, and it helps contain and circulate cerebral spinal fluid. And the villi that project into the dural venous sinuses are also responsible for reabsorbing cerebrospinal fluid back into the bloodstream. It's a very, very active and important part of the brain in terms of maintenance. I actually had a hemorrhage into this part of the brain when I broke my jaw, so I'm very well acquainted with it. So below is the innermost layer, which is called the pia mater, which means the tender mother. And it's also very highly vascular, and it conforms to the brain very, very precisely. It's a very precise coating of the brain, and it provides nourishment. It carries blood vessels that penetrate into the nerve tissue. It anchors the brain, and it helps maintain its shape, and it contributes to the production and regulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Bacteria generally get into that arachnoid and pia mater area there. And the subarachnoid space that's between them. And that's kind of where your cerebral spinal fluid is. So you have to remember the brain is kind of sitting in your head, protected by these layers, but also has a layer of fluid around it and inside the ventricles inside of it. And this fluid is very active. It's very important. It's what, if you can have too much of it, if you have hydrocephalus, it's what when they do a spinal tap, or if you're having a baby and you get one of those anesthesias, it's where the anesthesia is injected into that fluid. It's a very active and important. It communicates with the rest of the body. I mean, I literally could just sit and read and study the brain day and night. It's just absolutely fascinating. So what happens? So once you have to get the bacteria into the blood, right? So that's what has to happen first. Then the bacteria can kind of catch on tightly to the inside cells of the blood vessels, right? Especially the blood vessels that line the brain. They use those, remember those pili that I showed you, those finger-like extensions on the bacteria? They use those to kind of hold on and start pumping out the virulence factors there. So that interaction is going to trigger all kinds of signals that open the gap between that blood-brain barrier that's normally rather tight. And so the inflammation will cause that gap to open, and then the bacteria can basically cross through there and get into the cerebrospinal fluid and start snacking on your brain tissue. And you really don't want that to happen. And not only in the brain can this happen, it can happen in the abdomen, it can happen on limbs, that the bacteria, once it's bloodborne, can escape the blood vessels and get into and start snacking on you. And it's not advisable for this to happen. And it is completely, in my opinion, preventable. Like I said, they gain access to the blood. Once in the blood, they adhere tightly to those inside linings. And this is just a graphic that gives you a better idea of that. And you can see the blue blood vessel at the bottom. So that's really a blood vessel where, where a bacteria could have been transported from the throat into the blood compartment and then into that blood vessel, and then it escapes through the outside of that blood vessel and starts marching around into the subarachnoid space, the cerebral spinal fluid, and can float into your nervous system. It's just showing you a closer view of the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is a special kind of barrier, as you can see there, that it's very highly protected. It's got the endothelial cells, and the junctions between them are intact. There's a lot of integrity there, and it really selects what it allows into the brain and what it doesn't allow into the brain. It's protected pretty well there. Yeah, so that's really what I want to say on that. So that should give you some sort of a mental picture of what happens and how these bacteria can get into your brain and what those layers are. And there's actually a lot of immunologic protection from the pathway from the throat into the blood. And then it has to escape the immunity in the blood. So that takes some weakness for that to happen. And then it has to get into the blood-brain barrier, blood vessels, and permeate that. And each step of the way, the body has defenses that stops that from happening. And that's why you don't see a lot of death from meningitis. So I'd look at it more like that. We don't see a lot of death from it, given how many people actually get colonized with it. And I'll get into these actual statistics at the end. We have to consider whether or not you're just a sitting duck or a potential victim of this vicious bacteria that can take over your life, or if there are actions that can be taken to minimize the risk of invasive infections. The news media would have everybody thinking that you're a sitting duck, and the only solution you have is to go try to prevent it with a vaccine. So let's talk about some of the factors in host events. And I'm going to tell you that this is my list of factors or areas that I think is important. And this is an incomplete list, but nonetheless, it's the ones that I selected because I think that we can do a lot here. So young adults can get away with a lot of physical stress. And we know that because we were all young adults once. We know the kind of abuse that our bodies have taken and gotten away with if you're still alive. But everybody has a breaking point. Every immune system has a breaking point. And if too many insults occur at the same time, then we start to get fractures in immunity. And from there, a person can become a sitting duck for lots of different opportunistic infections, not just meningococcus B, but in my opinion, meningococcus B is an opportunistic infection, which means basically that certain conditions have to be present and met in order for it to do you damage. So I just want to talk a little bit about oxidation, and because we hear this a lot about reduction, oxidation, because that's kind of like my number one in natural defenses there. So oxidation, I'm just going to break it down really simple because we basically run on a DC electric current and we run on electrons and we separate out protons and electrons, and that's how we create charge in our bodies. And we're basically like jillions and jillions of batteries inside of other batteries. And that's how I've always seen life in the human body, especially as a nephrologist. But now I'm starting to understand the quantum biologicals a little bit better, and I can see it differently now. So I'm just going to explain it the way I see it, which is that oxidation is a loss of electrons and reduction is a gain of electrons. So if you can just remember that, you'll understand how vitamin C works, how glutathione works, how grounding works, and all these other things. So basically, our bodies run on that DC electric current, and these electrons get pumped and they get passed around proteins and molecules and chemicals that give us the energy to maintain life, basically. So basically, the difference between a dead rat and a live rat is this charge, this electron flow. The chemicals are all the same. It's the life force that's behind these electron flow. So while we can talk about molecules, we can talk about vitamins, which we will do in a minute, because I do think that there's importance in these things. You can understand the body more from a quantum and electric level, and that's kind of what I've been thinking and processing over the past year or so. Is that in conventional medicine we're taught that the body is this kind of pile of chemicals, and those chemicals can be altered, or you can go and have surgery and alter your body, and that's kind of on the macro level, right? But you've probably seen films where the biologist zooms into deeper and deeper levels inside the body. And so yes, when we go deeper, we do see molecules, but when you go deeper into a molecule, you see proteins, you see atoms. If you go even deeper into atoms, you see electrons and protons and neutrons. And if you go even deeper into that, you start to see these, leptons and muons and quarks and all these things that we talk about in quantum physics mechanics, which is why I quit physics, because it was just beyond me. But it's actually nonetheless really interesting to go back and to revisit it. And if you go even deeper, it's light. And light can actually hit something and knock electrons out. And you can actually take advantage of that by going and walking on the ground. Okay, so this is kind of just the short version of this. So it's really these changes in the electrons, the charges, the protons, and their gradients, meaning the buildup on one side versus the other side, and the movements that give us life. So even the microbes generate and respond to electricity. Even the microbes in your throat, the microbes in your gut, all generate and respond to electricity. And antibiotics can actually degrade this part of our electrical health by killing off bacteria. And mucous membranes have a polarity in health that's different than it is in disease. So the mucous membrane of your throat, your gut, your entire lining can change. And having the charges separated in the right places dictates function and dictates integrity of these barriers, and bioelectric properties in mucous membranes are different in smokers than non-smokers, for instance. It's also different in people who are living in really dry, hot, dusty heat environments, like what we might hear the meningitis belt in Africa, right? Or maybe in Kent in the wintertime on the inside when it's dry and hot and dusty, right? So these are setups for problems here because it changes the bioelectric charge in the mucous membranes. So when you see a body from an electric viewpoint, vaccines are hugely destructive especially if you look at the aluminum or aluminium, depending on where you are, since we're talking about Kent. So the components of vaccination, wow. I mean, from a chemical standpoint, it's startling, but from a quantum biological standpoint, it's like you don't want this stuff in your body. And we'll talk about that last item, Waldeyer's ring, in a minute. It's a really interesting part of the anatomy. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And so none of this is absolute, all right? But here's an officially known risk factor list. And it's a publicly available article by Lundbo, and it has references for the whole list. And, so you might hear this complement deficiency. So complement's actually a crucial part of the innate immune system. And it also links to adaptive immunity. And it consists of more than 30 proteins. All medical students have to learn them, and then we promptly forget them. But what we do know is that they're made by the liver. And when they're triggered, they can activate in a precise amplifying enzyme cascade, like a series of falling dominoes, like to help defend against pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, etc. And they clear out damaged cells and promote inflammation and healing. So the name complement comes from its original discovery. It complements or enhances the ability of antibodies to kill bacteria. So it's a really important. And so liver health would actually also be really important because that's where these proteins come from. So asplenia means not having a spleen, and the spleen filters out bacteria. It holds specialized macrophages that consume complement, whether it's coated or uncoated, and certain B cell stimulation begins in the spleen also. So when people have had their spleens out, they'll be told right away that they need to go get vaccinated for all these encapsulated bacteria, pneumococcus, Haemophilus influenza, Neisseria meningitis. Oh, they must go get vaccinated. I say, look, back up for a second. Think about this. Think about how long these vaccines actually work. Think about what the potential side effects are, what the components are, and what your actual lifestyle and risk factors are. Because I actually know many people personally who have had either accidents and lost their spleen or have had other reasons to have them removed, didn't take vaccines, and lived a full, happy life afterwards. Because for the same reasons I'm going to talk about today, that we have to look at what the risk factors are, not just that there are microbes that are ready to eat you alive, because your spleen is not your only defense. And so there's a whole list of all the other things that you'll hear about, especially you'll hear about it in the news. And we'll also talk about tonsillectomy in a minute. But next slide I want to talk about is the normal throat. And these are the bacteria that are found in throats of well individuals that don't wind up getting sick at all, okay? The vast majority of these people never get sick. The microbes in this list are found in normal throats. They're the most common microbes found during invasive bacterial infections in children. So both, right? So normal commensal bacteria are targeted with numerous repeated injectable vaccines. So for instance, first we had a pneumococcal bacteria and they were treating it with antibiotics. And then it developed antibiotic resistance because they used so many antibiotics for so long. And then they started treating it with vaccines, and they thought that was the answer. And then they realized the vaccine pressure had created new strains. And so it's just an never-ending cycle of trying to get more and more weapons against these microbes that just keep coming up with new ways to outsmart the pressure that's been exerted on them. And sometimes it's really quick that they outsmart it, and sometimes it takes longer. So even when scientists say that these microbes mostly cause no harm and we live harmoniously, they live harmoniously within us and are known to biochemically compete with each other and keep each other balanced, right? So these bacteria here do all of what I just said. For all but group B strep on that list, there have been aggressive vaccine campaigns in the past decades. And this has actually changed the overall microbial landscape in communities that have been vaccinated. But don't worry about that lack of a group B strep vaccine, because there is an active effort in developing a group B strep vaccine to be given to pregnant mothers who used to be protected against all sorts of toxins and now are told to get all sorts of vaccines, even though the package insert lists say that they have not been evaluated for carcinogenicity or teratogenicity, which means mutation of the genes. And it's just that there have been a few hurdles in making these vaccines, which you can imagine, but the World Health Organization has made it a priority, the Defending Meningitis by 2030 roadmap, which the next slide gives you a little bit of information. And the usual people are behind this effort, including Gates. The goal is to have a world free of meningitis, and in particular, adding another vaccine to pregnant women against group B strep. A lot of women are aware of this group B strep because it lives harmlessly in throats, it lives harmlessly in the vagina, and pregnant women are swabbed for it, and they are told that if they have it, that their baby is at risk. So they're told to take antibiotics while they're pregnant, which is going to alter their microbiome, which is going to alter their breast milk at some point as well, which I've been through in my infant immunity series. So don't get me wrong now, I have the same ideal about a world free of meningitis, but I know this can never be accomplished by the hands of the current medical industrial complex. Vaccines and antibiotics. Infection-associated death will only get better when the current conceptualization of disease in our society and in medical schools is realized as errant, that there was a big mistake made in the early 1900s when the Flexner Report and the Rockefeller's influence came in. And, leaving that conventional medicine is one of the best things I ever did, really. Vaccines and antibiotics being the answer to meningitis is like expecting chemotherapy and radiation to win the war on cancer. We know where that's gotten us, don't we? Remember the Nixon years? Nixon started the war on cancer, and it was supposed to be won very rapidly. Well, where have we gone with that? So even if you have a few battle wins, the war will always be a losing one for humanity when it's fought like this. And each generation over the past 40 or 50 years has visibly become weaker, and the microbial landscape is constantly being altered, not always for the better, by the pressure that vaccines against bacteria present. So let's look closer at some important biology that underpins the defense against invasive microbes. Here is a somewhat politically incorrect slide from New Zealand that was put out during the meningitis B outbreaks around 2002. And I didn't create this slide, but I'm just using it because I want it to show the fact that there are factors involved in disease rates that are changeable, right? This is true in New Zealand. It's true in the USA. It's true in Vietnam, as higher rates of invasive infection occur among also, we know in USA, African Americans, Alaskan Natives, specific American Indian populations compared to white people. Now, some of these described associations that I'm talking about here on the slide and USA, they disappear almost completely when adjusted for socioeconomic factors. So what does this mean? It means that this is not a genetic issue. This is not a racism issue. This is a modifiable issue. That's the point I want to make here. So for older children and young adults, like what happened in Kent, right? There has to be acknowledgement about the effects of nightclub activity, of hugging and kissing, of staying out late on artificial light and in blue light with high non-native EMF. See, this is stuff, I went to nightclubs when I was a teenager, but we just didn't have, all this non-native EMF. We didn't have all this blue light. It was a kind of a different world kids are living in today. These kids will be eating, garbage food, McDonald's, pizza, which isn't even really food. It just fills the belly up and it clogs up your inner workings and your electricity. They'll be sleeping in late because, they might have a hangover or they stayed up late and it becomes a way of life to sleep in late. You just don't take early morning classes. You sleep in late, you party at night, burning the candle at both ends. And like some of them, look, maybe they're sports stars and maybe they have to stay up late to complete their studies and then they don't even get enough sleep. So that's another possibility if they don't even sleep in late. Then we've got tight dorm living situations. We've got smoking. We've got cocaine. We've got vaping. I mean, all kinds of insults to the mucous membranes. Not getting much sunshine in the UK. Remember, what time of year did this happen, right? And what do people do in UK? Polly can tell you, they stay inside, they drink lots of tea, they turn on the heat, and that's the perfect environment for meningococcal B bacteria to float around and be able to get into the throat, because the throat actually changes with the dry air. The mucous membranes dry out, especially if you're sleeping, right, with your mouth open. And the dust in the air is actually really irritating, especially in these dry circumstances. And what you'll find in the African meningitis belt is that the meningitis epidemics actually end when the rain comes. So there's more of a reason to be celebrating the rain than just the crops will grow again. It's really that diseases go down when the rain comes because the moisture goes up And that's more of a healthy place for our mucous membranes to be. So, what I'm really trying to say here is that host factors open the door and make invasion much easier for any microbe, right? And what I really want people to understand is that vaccines don't treat meningitis at all. Only antibiotics will treat meningitis once it's fully established, and only if it's gotten in time. And even if there may be other more holistic treatment modalities, once you bring someone into the hospital and meningitis is diagnosed or suspected, they'll be infused with antibiotics for coverage of any suspected microorganisms. In general, what happens is the third generation cephalosporins are used in inpatient settings, and ciprofloxacin is used in the outpatient setting. So sometimes people still develop invasive bacterial disease if their vaccines weren't effective. That you might have got 3 or 4 shots of a vaccine and you can still get the meningococcal disease. Or you can have because you maybe were a primary non-responder, or because your vaccine antibodies waned, or because the vaccine that was used in you doesn't actually match the circulating serotype, which is why we have different meningococcal vaccines. We have one against AC, Y and W. I hope I'm getting that right. I'm not covering that in this talk. We have the one against the meningococcus B, which are slightly different in their composition. Core foundational health will be a strong defense against any microbe, whether there's a vaccine or not. And we have to consider the host factors before consenting to continually adding more and more jabs to an already toxic vaccine schedule. When did they remove vaccines off the vaccine schedule? Besides smallpox vaccine, which they tried to bring back in 2003. When? When have anybody seen a vaccine be removed from the vaccine schedule? They just keep adding them. These vaccine campaigns, they're expensive, like crazy expensive. And you all are paying for them. Your taxes are paying for this. And you're not profiting from it. Other people are profiting from it. And believe me, they're profiting handsomely. We're talking billions of dollars. So would you like your money to be used for programs that would do far more than stave off a few invasive bacterial infections for longer than a few months, which is what these jabs can do? And would you like to do something that doesn't run any risk of hurting you in the process? I know I would. Okay, so let's talk about what we can do here. First, I'm going to go through some more of the science regarding the vitamin C. And the next slide, you can see, and everybody that knows me for a long time knows that I really like vitamin C because I've actually seen the turnarounds happen in infectious diseases when it's given in proper doses safely, both orally and intravenously, actually. And there are some landmark studies that looked at vitamin C levels in meningitis. And that's what I want to cover here. So this article looked at ascorbate levels in the blood of sick people, okay? Chakrabarty investigated meningococcal meningitis, 25 cases, and also a bunch of other severe infections. And he compared the blood levels of dehydroascorbic acid and ascorbic acid in blood against normal controls. And the controls were 28 healthy subjects who were medical students. And believe me, medical students aren't the healthiest people on the planet. They're extremely stressed out for lots of reasons, but nonetheless, they served as controls. And so the next slide is going to show the results of this. And I'm just going to quickly explain the difference between DHAA, which is dehydroascorbic acid, versus ascorbic acid. So vitamin C is another electron donor, okay? And so the dehydroascorbic acid has given away its electrons in order to dampen down the inflammation that's occurred as a result of the infection, right? And the ascorbic acid is kind of the fresh vitamin C that would come out of, whatever you're eating or vitamins that you might be taking. And that has electrons to donate to keep your electrical system running. So note that the used form of vitamin C, that DHAA, is highest in the sickest, and the recycled or usable form is highest in the less sick people. So if we just look at those first few columns that I have outlined, in acute cases who didn't survive, they're mostly skewed towards the used up form of vitamin C. And in the convalescent cases, you see on the ascorbic acid side, 0.53, so compared to 0.19. So point being made there. So the bottom line, it seems likely that having a decent baseline antioxidant capacity would help make one less likely victim of any infection, but of meningitis. And if doctors gave vitamin C in and out of hospitals, or at least measured levels, maybe, because I've shown you in other, I think at least 2 other talks that I've done here, the studies that looked at the vitamin C levels of people before they go into hospital, when they're in the hospital, and after they leave, and it just goes down and down and down. I think that these outcomes would be better. So when scurvy exists, vitamin C is a logical and efficacious treatment option, okay? That's the bottom line here. And I'm not saying that all these kids in Kent should have been getting intravenous vitamin C as prophylaxis, but there's lots of ways to get antioxidant buildup into your body, to get vitamin C in your body, and to have it recycled so it can be, after it gets used up, so that dehydroascorbic acid form can actually be recycled back to ascorbic acid by other antioxidant chemicals like glutathione, et cetera. And this isn't happening in these particular people because those antioxidants are also getting consumed faster than they're being recycled or brought back into the body. So let's look at another study in the next slide by Kastenbauer in 2002. And he published this paper looking at various antioxidants in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid of people who had bacterial meningitis. So the last study was just looking at the blood, the difference between the used up form of ascorbic acid and the fresh form. And this study is going to look at the difference in lots of different chemicals and look at the difference between cerebrospinal fluid, you know, what the thing that bathes the brain and is very active and it can get invaded in meningitis, and versus the blood, and what the difference is. So let's look at the next slide. And I plucked out the parts that I thought were important for this talk, even though it's all important. So this chart's in the article. And first thing I want you to show you is that the uric acid level in the cerebrospinal fluid, if we look at that, look at the first column, the serum uric acid level in bacterial meningitis versus controls. And you can see that in both situations, the blood uric acid level is quite high, especially if you look at it compared to vitamin C levels. And why is that? Well, uric acid is actually really important in our bodies. And people, you know, in conventional medicine, uric acid is seen as the enemy, and people would like to get rid of it because they think they're getting rid of gout or they're getting rid of kidney stones. But after that vitamin C gene was broken in humans, which a lot of people know about, that's why we don't make vitamin C, there was another adaptive event that happened, which is an enzyme called uricase, also stopped in humans. And so uric acid levels rose, probably, in my opinion, to compensate and still give us the ability to have these antioxidants present in our body, because the fact of the matter is that uric acid is an antioxidant. Okay, it's trying to do a job. So if you have gout and you have high uric acid, well, yeah, it's probably because you don't have a great diet, but it's also because your body was really needing it. You generated it in order to dampen down inflammation. So uric acid is about 30 to 65% of the total free radical scavenging ability of the human plasma. It's very effective in detoxification, and it's roughly even in blood between patients and controls, as you can see there. It's not just a nuisance. So in humans and higher primates, uric acid largely replaced that ascorbate, and we can see this here. So also, I want you to look at the second column, which is the cerebrospinal fluid uric acid in bacterial meningitis versus controls. Okay, so the first one we looked at the blood uric acid. The second column is looking at the cerebrospinal fluid uric acid. And you can see in controls, they didn't really need to have that much uric acid in their cerebral spinal fluid. But once you get an invasion and have lots of inflammation in your cerebral spinal fluid, there's some sort of mechanism that raises that uric acid level up so that it can start to maybe recycle some of that uric acid some of that dehydroascorbic acid that's in there. And then if we look at the third column, we see in bacterial meningitis, the cerebral spinal fluid uric acid ratio differences. I'm going to skip that. Go to the fourth column. We look at cerebral spinal fluid ascorbic acid in bacterial meningitis versus controls. So look at the ascorbic acid level, how it's dropped in the bacterial meningitis and how it still stayed up nice and high in those controls. And so what happens is if you have inflammation in the brain, uric acid level in the cerebral spinal fluid goes up, your ascorbic acid level goes down. And this is all trying to help you. This is an effort to try to help you. And so there's other antioxidants like glutathione and superoxide dismutase that are also significantly decreased in children with bacterial meningitis. We know that. And it's due to the oxidative stress of the body, fighting this bacteria. So electrons are basically thwarted into battle during inflammation and not in formation where they should be, not recycled well. And thus the body loses its charge, it loses its vitality, and it can die if something isn't done to rectify the situation. While antioxidants from vitamin C, uric acid, or any external sources can help, when you're really healthy, or even if you're not that healthy, if you can get your butt outside and take your shoes off, or even take anything off and get yourself grounded, you can let electrons from the earth actually flow into your body and charge it through all the proteins that move your DC electric current through your body. This is called health maintenance, and there are many ways to get those electrons in. I'm not going to go through all those ways. We could maybe do a talk on that at some point in the future. But this is basically free energy. Everybody wants to talk about Tesla, free energy, Tesla, and free energy. Well, guess what, folks? When the sun hits the earth, and the photoelectric effect from the photons of the sun knocking the electrons up out of the ground, they are, ready to be absorbed. And the pores of your feet actually can take that in really efficiently. But, I advise getting as much of your body as you can out into the sun and out onto the ground. It's one of the best antioxidants available, yet most people rarely put their feet on the ground. And what happened once we started wearing shoes, they used to be leather bottoms, fine Italian shoes had leather bottoms, and then plastic and rubber was invented, and then we started to have a barrier between us and the earth. That was not a good invention. And there are shoes now that are being made that you can ground and earth. If you don't want to get your feet directly on the ground, there are bands that you can put around your shoes and tuck into your socks if you want. There are studs that you can put through sandals that can bring the current through. It's none of that is as good, in my opinion, as just getting your feet on the ground, because you're going to get a lot more surface area contact if you have your actual bare feet there. I just pulled this up because I just wanted a resource for people who wanted to learn more about this, DC electric current optimization, how it works with light, the electromagnetic fields, water, and biology. And so here's a reference for you. And just to know that circadian alignment builds endogenous, redox power and charge balance far better than isolated supplements can. And that these Kent meningitis cases would have been all out of balance in several ways. And so go ahead and have a read of this article if you want. It's free. It's available to the public. There are other resources that people can look into. There's a guy named Zaid Haddaj, Haddaj, who has an online course that talks about this. There is a Dr. Alexis Cowan, and there's Dr. Jack Cruz. And those are all other resources for you if you want to learn more about what I'm talking about. So some people can break it down better into plain English, and I've used all these resources, and I also use Grok sometimes for little minor details, because even though I have a physics degree, it's still taken me a long time to get my brain around this and really see it. But the more I see it, the more stunning and beautiful and amazing the whole thing is, and the more completely idiotic the approaches that the medical system takes to deal with health and deal with disease appears to me. All right, so next slide here. So let's come back to Earth, and or I should say, let's rise out of the Earth. The most common reasons. Let's talk about tonsillectomy, because this is something that used to occur a lot back in the polio years, back in the 1940s. Tonsils were removed prophylactically, especially in wealthy people. They would have the children would have their tonsillectomies before they went off to school, just so that they wouldn't get any problems with their tonsils. And so there was a realization at some point, especially in the polio years, that was a very bad idea, because polio was much more severe in people who had tonsillectomies, and they realized that the carriage rate was higher. It changes the immune globulin structures and types in the throat, having tonsillectomies. But I was very much anti-tonsillectomy until I had a discussion with Dr. Mary Talley Bowden, who kind of brought me back to earth. And so I just want to say that thank God for people like her, and for ear, nose, and throat surgeons when we need them. So I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm just trying to say that the baby is a lot smaller than the bathwater, okay? And so the most common reasons that we get for tonsillectomies in both children and adults is that they can get recurrent and chronic tonsillitis, repeated infections, maybe 6 or 7 or more per year, constantly being treated by antibiotics. I believe that when this happens, that we can eradicate this problem, but we're not going to eradicate it with antibiotics. And anybody who's brought me their child whose tonsils look like this, I've been able to help them. Once it gets to be pus or tonsillar stones, I can't help those people. And those are the people that we send to Mary so that she can treat them properly. And then we have chronic tonsillar hypertrophy, the enlarged tonsils. You can see on the left. I mean, I had tonsils like this probably until I was about 20 years old, but they can cause airway obstruction in some people. They can cause sleep apnea or difficulty swallowing and breathing. And again, I think that this is treatable, but without surgery. But now we get into tonsil stones, or we get into abscesses. These are medical emergencies. A tonsillar abscess, a peritonsillar abscess, this is not something I'm going to go, oh yeah, just swallow a little vitamin C, you'll be right, change your diet. No, you need to get to a doctor, and it needs to be lanced and treated properly. But I think that, and it's been my observation actually, Polly, probably you too, traveling around on the bus, that non-vaccinated healthy children are far less likely to have these problems like this. And I didn't actually know that it was possible to have a lifetime, a childhood without antibiotics until I met non-vaccinated children through the Steiner school system and when we traveled on the bus, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So like I said, I think there are ways to clear out the tonsils so they don't get like this, but sometimes removal seems like the best option. And so the medical profession does save some lives, and we have to give them credit for that. When things get very much out of control. But tonsillectomies have long been known to open people up to infections and colonization of microbes that people with tonsils don't have so much. And it has to be taken into consideration very seriously because of the after effects of the removal of the tonsillectomy. So I question how many of those kids in Kent had their tonsils removed beforehand. I wasn't able to get that data. I don't think it's even available. So what happens to tonsils in terms of Neisseria meningitis? We actually have 2 key research studies that show higher carriage rates, meaning colonization or, living there rates of the Neisseria meningitis bacteria after tonsillectomy. So we're going to go ahead and look at both of them. So here's the first reference, and this is a cross-sectional study conducted in Iceland, and researchers collected throat swabs from 722 healthy participants to detect meningococcal carriage. Here are the carriage numbers that were verified with PCR and with culture, and the key findings, pretty startling here. The overall meningococcal carriage rate, 4.8%, right? But when you divide them up, among the 88 participants who had previously undergone tonsillectomy, 11.4% of them carried meningococci. And among those who had not had a tonsillectomy, only 4% carried the bacteria. So there's no argument here. And it's very well accepted in the medical community that having a tonsillectomy is associated with a 3-fold increased risk of meningococcal colonization. It doesn't mean that you're going to get the infection into your bloodstream. It doesn't mean that you're going to get meningitis. It just means that you're more likely to have that bacteria sitting there that can be detected by a scientist putting a swab there. Here's the other study showing pretty much the same thing. This was an observational study in Norway. 160 people were admitted for tonsillectomy, and it looked at those people and 170 healthy controls. And throat swabs were taken at 3 months apart to detect the Neisseria meningitis carriage. And in the final analyzed group, there were 75 patients and 65 controls. And this chart is from the write-up, and I found it extremely confusing. So I'm just going to give you the bottom line and explain it. But what we have is 15 new Neisseria meningitis bacteria carriers appeared in the tonsillectomy group among the 62 patients who were initially negative for that bacteria, as shown in the red squares, right? And then in the control group that didn't have a tonsillectomy, there were no new carriers developing Neisseria meningitis colonization in the 62 who were initially negative. And I showed those with the red arrows there. So the difference was highly statistically significant with a p-value of, for you statistics geeks, 0.00001. All right, so I think I've made my case. This needs to be mentioned because it's not just about carriage rates, but this was a large population-based cohort study using Danish national health registries. Over 1 million children born between 1979 and 1999 were followed until 2009. It was a minimum of 10 years and up to 30 years of follow-up. And they compared children who had adenoidectomy, tonsillectomy, or both before the age of 9 with matched controls who didn't have the surgery. And if you had adenoidectomy alone, you had a nearly twofold higher long-term risk of upper respiratory tract disease and COPD, that's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If you had a tonsillectomy alone, you had a 2.7-fold higher risk of upper respiratory tract disease. If you had both tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy, you had a 17% higher risk of overall infectious diseases. And small increases in allergic diseases were also seen. So the point to be made here is that if you can avoid having a tonsillectomy, that's a really good idea, because not just for the short term, but actually for the long term. And there are actually other studies in adults that show you that there are other functions of tonsils moving into adulthood that are lost if you have your tonsils taken out when you're younger. And that was beyond the scope of this talk.
Can you tell everyone your name
Mackenzie Mitchell.
and how old are you?
I'm 24 years old.
24 years. Okay, so take us back to what happened when you were playing softball.
So I was playing college softball at ETSU. I was on a scholarship, and I was playing my 5th year because the season before we had taken away from us because of COVID, so we all got a bonus year. So this was my last year ever playing softball, and I was a pitcher. And so basically we came back to school August of 2021 and had our first softball meeting of the year with our athletic trainers and coaches and everybody. And we were basically told that if you didn't have the vaccine, it would be really, really difficult for you to play. We had to get tested 3 days a week at like 6 in the morning if you weren't vaccinated, which I was not at the time. I did not want the vaccine, let's just say that. And until this meeting where they told us it was safe and effective, and like I said, you have to get it in order to play. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to miss my last year ever playing softball, which I've played since I was like 3 years old. And I got the first dose, and
Pfizer?
Yes, of Pfizer. And I was good as far as I knew. And then on September 13th, 2021, I got the second dose of Pfizer. And 3 days later is when everything started. And so the first time I noticed anything, I was at practice and I was pitching and I fell twice. I didn't feel any pain, don't know what happened. I just fell to the ground twice, didn't think anything of it. And I kept going. We had our first scrimmage coming up that Friday. Well, the day after my leg gave out, I started having a 48-hour migraine, is what it ended up being, which at the end of that, I was not really able to speak. I would try to say like bird and couch would come out of my mouth. It was like totally opposite words that didn't go together and wasn't what I was trying to say would come out of my mouth. I couldn't read. I was trying to read something on my phone. I couldn't figure out which letter was what or how to say it or anything. And then my talking was just all crazy. I was very disoriented and dizzy. So come to find out, they think it was a mini stroke. But that wasn't the end of it. That weekend I was fine, and then got back to weightlifting that Monday, which this was probably about a week after I had the second dose of Pfizer. And all of a sudden I was doing a lunge, which I'd done a million times in my life, but it was really hard and I couldn't seem to like do a lunge. My leg was so weak, my left leg was. And then I stood up, stopped working out, and my left leg started shaking. And then I fell to the ground like 2 more times. So I was rushed to my athletic trainer, where I tried to lift my leg off the table and it was shaking like this. I had no control over my leg, and that's when I knew something was really wrong. And so I went to the team doctor we had on staff at ETSU. He told me it was a complicated migraine and my leg would be fine in a couple days, which was not the case at all. But I wasn't cleared to play softball until I saw a neurologist, and I couldn't get that appointment until 2 weeks later. So during those 2 weeks, it got way worse to the point where I couldn't stand up without falling, or my legs shaking longer than like 30 seconds. I couldn't walk 10 feet without falling, and I just had completely lost control over my left leg. And then I got to the neurologist finally, ran several tests, and I didn't know anything about the vaccine at this point, but I had a friend reach out to me and ask me if I had had it, and I was like, yeah, I did, and she told me to tell my neurologist that I had had the vaccine. And so after several tests and everything, I let him know that I did have it, and he did a nerve conduction study on me, which found out all the nerves in my left leg were inflamed, and he did admit to me it was from the vaccine.
How did he say it?
He just said all the nerves in your left leg are inflamed, which is from the vaccine you've got, and he knew that because he told me it was a mild case. My case was very mild. He was seeing tons of people that were like paralyzed for life from it, or have had way more severe cases than mine, because I could walk sometimes, but then other times I had no control of my leg. It was just like that, it would change. And he did write on my notes that it was monoplegia, so I was paralyzed in my left leg.
All because you took a COVID shot?
Yes.
And so that ruined your softball career?
It did. And after that appointment, I posted on social media. I took my story to social media, which I still had not heard, besides the people he told me that were injured by it, of anybody else being injured. So I posted it, and I had hundreds of people reach out to me telling me their stories of what happened when they got the COVID vaccine, and that, they had lost loved ones, or they had way worse stuff than I did. So it was just crazy, all of that coming in, and I had no idea, but then I learned what it could do after it happened to me.
Oh, I'm so sorry this happened to you. And how does it affect you on your daily basis now?
So after this, I was told I had to go to physical therapy 3 days a week. That was the only thing that would help. And so I started going to physical therapy 3 days a week, and then the other days I would have to do physical therapy myself at home. Did that for about 4 months, and I went from squatting with a bar and 45s on each side and playing college softball to my physical therapy was me sitting on a table trying to lift my leg up. And one day, it was probably 4 months later, I did my physical therapy, couldn't lift my leg up, it was shaking. The next morning I woke up to do my physical therapy at my own house, and all of a sudden my leg lifted up, no shaking, had complete control of my leg. It was truly a miracle, and nobody can explain that. Like, no doctor can explain it, so I know it was definitely a miracle. But after that, after that, the nerves in my leg were healed, but at that point I had to reteach all my muscles and everything to coordinate together to be able to walk again. And then once I was able to walk again, then I had to learn to exercise again. And I actually got back to playing softball that February, so it happened September. I was able to get back to softball in February. I played about a month with no falling, no issues. It was incredible. And then all of a sudden it started again. So this time it was when I did strenuous exercise or was pitching. I would be in the middle of a game and try to push through, but then my leg would fall and coaches and teammates had to carry me off the field. So I tried to play the rest of my season, but didn't really make it that far in games. And the neurologist told me I had a tremor in my leg now from all of the trauma that it endured. So back to physical therapy that summer I went, and it wasn't until around August of 2022, I think was the last time I fell.
Wow, thank you so much for telling this story. Now, does that made you relook at the whole vaccine schedule now?
Yes, since then I have learned so much about it. Something that's actually interesting, I looked back at my personal, vaccine records. And I had gotten all the shots and stuff. And when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I began having tics and had to see a neurologist a lot. And I got diagnosed with OCD when I was in 3rd or 4th grade. And when I look back now, it started right after I got a flu shot. And so I was able to connect dots from, something that happened to me a long time ago and really see that it was from the shot. And now I know a lot about the dangers of those and how many people are affected by it. So it's really changed my whole mind.
So one day when you have children, will you give them vaccines?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. None at all.
So the only good thing that came out of that is you've saved your future children from ever being vaccinated.
Yes.
But
Yes.
You took one for the team, for them.
I
the
did.
future.
And I have a lot of people ask me if I regret taking the vaccine. And even though with every bone in my body I knew I shouldn't have got it, but then kind of got coerced into taking it, I truly would say no, I don't regret it, just because I was made aware of all the dangers of it. And I've gotten to share my story with tons of people all over the country, and I've got to spread awareness about it. And so I really believe God gave me this story for a reason, and I hope that others, would hear my story and not get the vaccine.
Thank you. Thank you. We need young voices like yours, so we really appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.